It didn't begin with a public announcement or a royal statement, it began with a look. A fleeting, unreadable glance exchanged between Prince Philip and King Charles III inside a private chamber few were ever allowed to enter. Staff would later admit that something in that moment shifted something cold, final, and impossible to undo. What they witnessed that day would ripple through the monarchy in ways no one could contain. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It was supposed to be routine, or at least that's how it was presented to those stationed just beyond the heavy doors. A scheduled discussion, a private exchange between father and son, nothing more. But those who stood closest to that room would later struggle to reconcile what they heard with what they had been told to expect, because what unfolded behind those walls did not sound like diplomacy, nor did it resemble the carefully controlled tone the monarchy had spent decades perfecting. Reports suggest the voices rose quickly, not in anger alone, but in something deeper, something layered with years of unspoken tension, restrained disagreements, and the weight of a legacy neither man could escape. Insiders whisper that it wasn't just a conversation, it was a reckoning, one that had been building quietly beneath the surface for far longer than anyone outside their inner circle realized. Those positioned in the corridor exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to move, unsure whether to pretend they heard nothing at all, because within the institution, silence was often the safest response. And yet, even silence couldn't fully mask what was happening. The tone, by several accounts, shifted from controlled to confrontational, from measured to deeply personal, as if the discussion had crossed an invisible line neither man had intended to approach. Different interpretations of that moment describe a visible intensity in the body language, sharp movements, prolonged pauses, a kind of stillness that only appears when words carry consequences too heavy to take back. And then, just as suddenly as it escalated, it stopped. Not gradually, not with resolution, but with a kind of abrupt finality that left those outside the room more unsettled than before. When the doors eventually opened, the change was immediate and unmistakable. Observers would later note that King Charles III emerged altered in a way that could not be explained by a simple disagreement. There was a weight in his expression, a restraint that seemed newly imposed, as though something had been decided in that room, something that had shifted the balance of understanding between him and Prince Philip. Aides were quickly instructed to minimize documentation, to leave certain details unrecorded. An unusual move in an institution built on meticulous archives and carefully preserved records. Palace administrative streams, ranging from quiet staff recollections to subtle changes in internal communication, began to reflect a new tension, one that spread quietly but unmistakably through the corridors. Media insiders would later claim that something had felt off for weeks, though no one could quite identify why, and now, with fragments of this moment surfacing, those earlier suspicions began to take on a more defined shape. But what truly unsettled those closest to the crown wasn't the argument itself. It was what Philip did next, and what it implied about the future of the monarchy. Long before that confrontation, a silent blueprint had already been drawn, one rooted in duty, preservation, and control. For decades, Prince Philip had quietly shaped the monarchy's internal structure, ensuring that certain traditions would never be compromised. But as King Charles III prepared for a different kind of reign, those foundations suddenly stood on uncertain ground. It is often said, in hushed tones among those familiar with the inner workings of the crown, that Philip's influence was never loud, never theatrical, but deeply embedded, woven into the very mechanisms that governed how the monarchy functioned behind closed doors. He was not merely a consort, he was, by many accounts, a silent architect of continuity, someone who understood that the survival of the institution depended not on change, but on controlled resistance to it. Reports suggest that over the years, he had positioned himself as a guardian of what some insiders call the unwritten code, a framework of expectations and boundaries that defined how power, property, and legacy were to be handled within the royal structure. These were not rules found in public records, but they carried a weight that few dared to challenge. Estates, titles, ceremonial authority, each element existed within a delicate balance, one that Philip had spent decades reinforcing with precision and unwavering discipline. But time, as it always does, introduced a new variable. As King Charles III stepped closer to the reality of his reign, a different vision began to take shape, one that, according to various interpretations, leaned toward modernization, adaptation, and a redefinition of what the monarchy should represent in a rapidly changing world. Insiders whisper that this vision, while not entirely at odds with tradition, carried enough divergence to unsettle those who believed the institution's strength lay in its resistance to transformation. It wasn't a rebellion, not openly, but a gradual shift in tone, in approach, in priorities. And within that shift, tension began to build. Palace administrative streams, ranging from quiet advisory notes to subtle changes in decision-making patterns, hinted at disagreements that were never publicly acknowledged. The handling of key royal assets, those symbolic and tangible pillars of the crown's authority, became a focal point of concern. Different interpretations of internal discussions describe moments where perspectives clashed, not in open defiance, but in a measured, restrained friction that carried deeper implications than either side was willing to admit. Historical precedent, too, played its part. Philip was known to look backward in order to move forward, drawing on examples from past reigns where deviation from established norms had led to instability, even crisis. To him, tradition was not a limitation but a safeguard, a proven system that had endured precisely because it resisted unnecessary change. But to Charles, according to those familiar with his long-held views, there was a growing recognition that survival might require evolution, that relevance demanded a willingness to adapt. And so, beneath the surface, a quiet conflict began to take shape, a conflict not defined by anger, but by ideology, by two fundamentally different interpretations of duty. One rooted in preservation at all costs, the other in cautious transformation. As these opposing forces edged closer to confrontation, those within the inner circle began to sense that something inevitable was approaching, something that could no longer be managed through silence alone. And according to those who later spoke out, the clash wasn't just ideological, it became something far more personal, far more explosive. It was never meant to be seen. Yet fragments of that confrontation slipped through the kind of details only those standing just outside the door could piece together. Staff would later admit that the exchange between Prince Philip and King Charles III was unlike anything they had ever witnessed before, sharp, unfiltered, and deeply final. What began as controlled discussion, shaped by decades of royal discipline, reportedly escalated into something far more volatile. Something that those present would later struggle to even describe without hesitation. Reports suggest the voices carried through the thick palace doors in a way that defied the usual insulation of privacy, each word edged with a weight that felt impossible to ignore. It wasn't simply volume, it was intensity, the kind that signals a breaking point rather than a disagreement. Insiders whisper that Prince Philip, long known for his unwavering composure, took a stance that left little room for negotiation, his position described by those familiar with his temperament as firm, immovable, almost resolute to the point of finality. There was no softening, no measured retreat, only a clarity that suggested he had already made up his mind long before that conversation ever began. And then came the response. Different interpretations of the moment describe King Charles III breaking from the controlled restraint that had defined his public and private persona for decades. It wasn't theatrical, not in the way outsiders might imagine, but it was unmistakable. A shift in tone, a rise in emotion, a departure from the careful composure expected within those walls. Those positioned nearby exchanged uneasy glances, caught between duty and instinct, unsure whether what they were hearing required intervention or absolute silence. Within the monarchy, knowing when not to act is often as important as knowing when to step in, and in that moment, hesitation prevailed. One staff member would later describe it as the instant a line was being drawn not just between two individuals, but between two visions, two interpretations of what the crown demanded and what it could no longer tolerate. Palace administrative streams, ranging from fragmented recollections to subtle shifts in internal communication, began to reflect the gravity of what had just unfolded, though no official acknowledgement ever surfaced. And then, just as suddenly as it had erupted, everything stopped. Not with resolution, not with compromise, but with a silence so complete it felt deliberate. The kind of silence that follows a decision already made. Those outside the room would later recall how the absence of sound carried more weight than the confrontation itself, as though whatever had been said in those final moments had closed the door on any possibility of reversal. When the meeting ended, there were no raised voices, no lingering exchanges, only the quiet understanding that something irreversible had taken place. Observers would later note that both men emerged, changed in subtle but undeniable ways, their composure restored on the surface, yet marked by something deeper beneath it. And for those who witnessed even fragments of that moment, the realization began to settle in. This was not a passing conflict, not a temporary fracture, but a turning point that would ripple outward in ways no one could yet fully grasp. But the most chilling detail wasn't the argument itself, it was the decision Philip made immediately afterward. Within hours of that encounter, something shifted behind palace walls quietly, deliberately, and with unmistakable intent. Prince Philip, long known for his restraint, reportedly set into motion a decision that would alter the balance of power within the royal family and leave King Charles III facing consequences he hadn't anticipated. It did not arrive with announcement or ceremony. There was no declaration, no visible disruption, nothing that an outside observer could immediately identify. And yet, for those inside the institution, the change was undeniable. Reports suggest that within a matter of hours, instructions began to circulate subtly at first, then increasingly precise, originating from channels rarely activated unless something of serious importance had been triggered. Insiders whisper that this was not a reaction formed in the heat of the moment, but the execution of a mechanism long prepared, a contingency shaped by years of quiet foresight. What had occurred in that room had not created the response, it had merely activated it. Different interpretations of palace administrative movements describe a tightening of access, a narrowing of influence, as though invisible boundaries had been redrawn overnight. Certain discussions, once open to a broader circle of senior advisors, reportedly became restricted, limited to a smaller, more carefully selected group. Those familiar with internal protocol noted the shift immediately, recognizing it as a sign that authority was being recalibrated behind the scenes. Senior aides, many of whom had operated within a stable structure for years, suddenly found themselves navigating revised instructions, some receiving guidance that contradicted previous directives, others quietly removed from conversations they had once been central to. It was not chaotic, it was controlled, deliberate, almost surgical in its precision. And that precision is what unsettled those who understood its implications. Because within the monarchy, true power is rarely exercised loudly, it is enforced through access, through proximity, through the ability to shape decisions before they are ever made public. At the center of this shift stood King Charles III, and for the first time in years, there were whispers of isolation. Not visible isolation, not something that could be captured in public appearances, but something quieter, more internal. Observers would later suggest that his presence within certain decision-making spaces appeared reduced, his influence seemingly redirected rather than removed. It was a distinction that carried enormous weight. Palace insiders, speaking cautiously, began to question whether this was a temporary recalibration or something far more enduring. The reshuffling of advisory influence added to that uncertainty. Long-standing figures within the inner circle found their roles subtly altered, while others, previously operating in the background, appeared to gain prominence. It was not a purge, not a replacement, but a reordering, one that suggested a deliberate attempt to stabilize something that had been shaken. And as these changes unfolded, concern began to ripple quietly through those closest to the institution. Not alarm, not panic, but a growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted. The monarchy had always relied on continuity, on the careful preservation of its internal balance, and yet here was evidence that that balance could be adjusted swiftly, decisively, and without public acknowledgement. Reports from those observing the aftermath describe an atmosphere of heightened awareness, where every movement, every instruction, carried a significance that could not be ignored. Because beneath the surface, beneath the silence and the controlled appearances, a new dynamic was taking shape, one that would influence every decision moving forward. And as the implications of that move began to unfold, it became clear that this wasn't just a disagreement, it was a silent power shift. In the days that followed, the atmosphere within royal circles grew unmistakably heavy. Conversations were shorter, movements more calculated, And at the center of it all stood King Charles III, visibly affected, yet bound by a silence he could not break. Those closest to the situation began to realize the fallout had only just begun. It wasn't the kind of disruption that announced itself loudly. It was quieter, more suffocating, settling into the rhythm of daily operations until even routine exchanges carried an undercurrent of tension. Reports suggest that those who had worked alongside Charles for years began to notice subtle but undeniable changes, pauses where there had once been certainty, restraint where confidence had previously guided decisions. Insiders whisper that his demeanor, both in private and during carefully managed appearances, reflected a man navigating something unresolved, something that could not be addressed openly yet could not be ignored. It was not weakness, but weight, the kind that alters how every word is chosen, how every action is measured. Around him, the response was equally telling. Senior members of the royal family, those accustomed to navigating internal complexities, appeared to step back, not dramatically, not in a way that would invite speculation, but just enough to create distance from whatever had taken root behind the scenes. Different interpretations of this shift suggest a quiet recalibration of roles, as though each individual was instinctively adjusting their position within an evolving dynamic. Aides, often the unseen architects of communication, found themselves moving with increased caution, carefully managing what was said, what was shared, and perhaps most importantly, what was left unsaid. Palace administrative streams, once flowing with predictable consistency, began to reflect a new level of scrutiny, as if every message carried implications beyond its immediate purpose. It wasn't confusion, it was awareness, a recognition that the internal balance had shifted and that navigating it required precision. Trust, too, became a silent casualty, not shattered in any obvious sense, but fractured in ways that were difficult to define yet impossible to ignore. Those within the inner circle reportedly began to question not only decisions, but intentions, reading deeper into actions that might once have passed without concern. It was the kind of environment where certainty erodes gradually, replaced by a cautious vigilance that changes how relationships function. Insiders describe an unspoken understanding that something fundamental had changed, even if no one could or would fully articulate it. And while the institution itself continued to project stability, the effort required to maintain that image grew increasingly apparent to those working behind the curtain. Beyond palace walls, the shift did not go entirely unnoticed. Media insiders, attuned to even the slightest variations in tone and timing, began to sense that something was different. Not enough to confirm, not enough to report definitively, but enough to raise questions. The carefully controlled narrative of continuity and composure remained intact, yet beneath it, there were signals, subtle inconsistencies, delayed responses, an almost imperceptible tension that suggested more was happening than what was being presented. Palace efforts to maintain outward stability intensified, reinforcing the image of unity and control, even as internal dynamics told a more complicated story. And through it all, King Charles III remained at the center, navigating a reality that demanded both authority and restraint, strength and silence. The contrast between his public role and private burden became increasingly pronounced, shaping not only his actions but the atmosphere around him. Because within the monarchy, perception is as powerful as reality, and maintaining that perception often requires sacrifices that are never acknowledged. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of what had occurred continued to ripple outward, touching every corner of the institution in ways that could not be easily reversed. But the most revealing part of the story wouldn't emerge until much later, when those who witnessed it finally began to speak. It came not through headlines, but through whispers, quiet admissions from those who had once been sworn to silence. A palace aide, speaking cautiously, began to confirm what many had long suspected. What happened between Prince Philip and King Charles III that day was far more than a disagreement, it was a defining fracture. The revelation did not arrive all at once. It unfolded gradually, piece by piece, carried through conversations never meant to leave private circles, shaped by hesitation and the careful choice of words. Reports suggest that this aide, someone deeply familiar with the rhythms of royal protocol, described the confrontation as unprecedented, a term not used lightly within an institution where even the most intense moments are often softened by tradition. Insiders whisper that what made it so extraordinary was not simply the volume or the emotion, but the unmistakable sense of finality that hung over the exchange, as though both men understood, in that moment, that something fundamental had shifted beyond repair. Different interpretations of the Aide's account point to an emotional intensity that defied the usual boundaries of royal conduct. Prince Philip, often defined by his discipline and restraint, was described as unwavering, almost immovable in his position, driven by a conviction that appeared rooted in years of observation and concern. There was no hesitation, no attempt to soften the implications of what he was asserting. It was, according to those familiar with his perspective, the culmination of long-standing tensions that had quietly built over time, tensions that had remained contained only because neither side had been forced to confront them directly. But that day changed everything. The Aide suggested that the discussion crossed from disagreement into something far more personal, touching on questions of responsibility, legacy, and the future direction of the monarchy itself. And once that boundary was crossed, there was no returning to what had existed before. For King Charles III, the impact was equally profound, though described in a different way. Sources close to the inner workings of the palace indicate that he may not have anticipated the extent of Philip's resolve, or the consequences that would follow from it. There was an expectation, perhaps, that the conversation would remain within the familiar boundaries of negotiation and compromise. But instead, it became something else entirely, a moment where positions were not adjusted, but fixed, where the possibility of mutual understanding gave way to a clear and irreversible divide. The Aide's account reinforces this idea, suggesting that Charles's response, while deeply felt, could not alter the trajectory that had already been set in motion. It was not a failure of communication, but a clash of convictions, each shaped by different interpretations of duty and responsibility. What makes this revelation even more striking is the emphasis on how carefully it was contained. Palace administrative streams, from internal documentation practices to controlled communication channels, reportedly worked to ensure that details of the encounter remained limited, fragmented, almost impossible to reconstruct in full. This level of control, according to those who understand the system, is reserved for moments of significant sensitivity, events that carry implications far beyond the individuals directly involved. And yet, despite those efforts, the truth has a way of surfacing, not in full clarity, but in enough fragments to form a picture that cannot be entirely dismissed. The Aide's quiet admission does not provide every detail, nor does it claim to, but it offers something perhaps more powerful, a confirmation that what occurred was not routine, not manageable, and certainly not forgettable. It was a fracture, one that would continue to influence decisions, relationships, and perceptions long after the moment itself had passed. And yet, even with these revelations, one question lingered: what did this moment ultimately change? History doesn't always shift with grand gestures. Sometimes it turns on a single moment, hidden behind closed doors. For King Charles III, that moment may have come in the presence of Prince Philip, a moment that quietly reshaped the path he would be forced to follow. It wasn't immediate, not in a way that could be measured overnight, but those who observed closely began to notice a gradual recalibration, a subtle but persistent shift in how Charles approached the immense responsibility now resting on his shoulders. Reports suggest that his leadership style, once defined by a willingness to explore new directions, became more measured, more cautious, as though every decision now carried the echo of that confrontation. Insiders whisper that the weight of legacy, once something he balanced alongside personal vision, began to assert itself more forcefully, shaping choices in ways that were not always visible but deeply consequential. Different interpretations of his actions in the months that followed point to a heightened awareness of tradition, not as a constraint, but as a boundary that could not easily be crossed. It was not a complete retreat from modernization, but a recalibration of how far and how fast change could be pursued. Those familiar with the internal workings of the monarchy describe a growing emphasis on continuity, on preserving the structures that had endured for generations, even as the world outside those walls continued to evolve. The handling of royal traditions, once open to subtle reinterpretation, appeared to take on a new level of care. Each decision weighed not only against present expectations, but against the long shadow of history. Palace administrative streams, from advisory consultations to ceremonial planning, began to reflect this shift, suggesting that the influence of legacy had become more deeply embedded in the decision-making process. At the same time, the internal dynamics of the institution underwent changes that were less visible but no less significant. Relationships within the inner circle, already shaped by hierarchy and protocol, adapted to the new reality, with roles and influence subtly redefined. Some voices grew quieter, others more prominent, creating a balance that felt both familiar and altered. It was not disruption, it was evolution, guided by an understanding that the stability of the monarchy depended on its ability to absorb change without appearing to be changed. And within that delicate balance, the enduring authority of Prince Philip remained unmistakable. Though no longer present in the same capacity, his influence continued to shape the institution, not through direct action, but through the principles he had reinforced over decades. Insiders suggest that his perspective, rooted in discipline and preservation, became a reference point, a standard against which decisions were quietly measured. The broader struggle between past and future, between preservation and transformation, did not disappear, it deepened. For King Charles III, this meant navigating a path that required constant negotiation between competing forces, each demanding recognition, each carrying its own risks. The contrast between ambition and restraint, between innovation and tradition, became more pronounced, shaping not only his leadership but the direction of the monarchy itself. It was a balancing act that left little room for error, where even the smallest decision could carry far-reaching implications. And yet, for all the changes that followed, the true impact of that moment remained difficult to define, existing somewhere between what was seen and what was felt, between what was acknowledged and what remained unspoken. Because in the end, the most significant transformations are often the ones that unfold quietly, leaving behind traces that can only be understood in hindsight. But even now, those who understand the weight of that moment know the story doesn't truly end there. No official record fully captures it. No statement confirms it. And yet, within the quiet corridors of the monarchy, that moment still echoes. What unfolded between Prince Philip and King Charles III remains one of the most quietly consequential encounters in modern royal history, felt, remembered, but never truly spoken aloud. It exists not in official archives or carefully curated narratives, but in the spaces between them, in the pauses, the omissions, the deliberate silences that define how the institution protects itself. Reports suggest that those closest to the crown learned quickly that some moments are not meant to be preserved in writing, but instead carried forward through understanding, through subtle shifts in behavior, through the unspoken recognition that something irreversible has taken place. Insiders whisper that this particular moment became one of those rare events too significant to ignore, yet too sensitive to fully acknowledge. And so it lingered, not as a defined chapter, but as an undercurrent, shaping decisions and perceptions long after the voices in that room had faded. The silence surrounding it is perhaps its most powerful feature. Within an institution built on continuity and control, silence is not absence, it is strategy. Different interpretations of how this moment was handled suggest that the lack of formal acknowledgement was not an oversight, but a deliberate choice, one that ensured the narrative remained intact while the reality beneath it quietly evolved. Palace administrative streams, known for their precision and detail, reportedly reflect this absence in subtle ways, with gaps that are not errors but intentional omissions. It is in these gaps that speculation thrives. Observers, both inside and outside royal circles, have continued to piece together fragments, searching for meaning in what was never directly stated. Media voices, constrained by the same boundaries that define access, have hinted at underlying tensions, but without confirmation, the story remains suspended between possibility and certainty. And yet, within the monarchy itself, the impact of that moment is understood in ways that do not require documentation. The power of unspoken history lies in its ability to influence without being seen, to guide actions without being referenced. For King Charles III, this meant carrying forward a legacy shaped not only by tradition, but by a confrontation that redefined his understanding of it. For those around him, it meant adapting to a reality where certain boundaries had been clarified, even if they were never publicly drawn. The institution, as it has done for centuries, absorbed the moment, folding it into its ongoing narrative without disruption, yet not without consequence. Because while the monarchy presents itself as unchanging, its strength has always come from its ability to evolve quietly, to adjust beneath the surface while maintaining the appearance of continuity. In the end, what remains is not a detailed account, but a resonance, a sense that something important occurred, something that altered the course of events in ways that can only be understood through reflection. The enduring silence does not diminish its significance, it amplifies it. It transforms the moment from a single event into a lasting influence, one that continues to shape how the monarchy navigates its delicate balance between past and future, authority and restraint. And perhaps that is where its true power lies, not in what was revealed, but in what was deliberately withheld. Because within an institution defined by legacy, the most important stories are often the ones that are never fully told. Because in the end, it wasn't just what was said in that room, it was what was never said again that defined everything that followed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.